Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is John Rumpler. I'm the Clean Water Program Director for Environment America. Joining me, Katie Craig from North Carolina PIRG, Public Interest Research Group. And again, together we're part of the Public Interest Network, working to protect the environment, public health, consumers, and a broad range of issues. And today we're focused on the threat to drinking water and our health related to forever chemicals, otherwise known by their initials of PFAS chemicals, which have been getting into drinking water and threatening public health all across the country. So thanks for joining. The good news is that there are really common sense solutions, and state legislators across the country are playing a critical role in advancing those solutions, as we'll get to today. To start off, Katie is going to give us an overview of the issue, the problems of PFAS and the threats that it poses to our health, how that issue has played out in North Carolina. And then I'll come in after and review some of the solutions that we're seeing being advanced, both at the federal level and in state capitals across the country. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So with that, Katie, why don't you take it away?
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. So first, I wanted to just start us off with big picture. What are PFAS chemicals, or these forever chemicals as they're known? So many of you may already know this, and that's why you're joining us today, but just a quick review. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances and refers to a class of chemicals that is found in many household and consumer products that we use every day, things from makeup to frying pans to fast food packaging, rain gear, and more. And these chemicals are often used because of their grease and water resistant properties. And they've earned this nickname forever chemicals because they don't break down in our environment. And so here you can see some of the common areas where these chemicals can be found. And as you can see, it really stretches a broad array of different types of consumer products and areas of things that we use. So why are these chemicals a problem then? And simply put, it's because these chemicals are toxic and widely unregulated. So PFAS chemicals have been linked to a number of different health impacts, including decreased brain function, impaired immune systems, fertility issues, and even some types of cancer. These serious impacts are also compounded by the fact that these chemicals bioaccumulate in our environment and in our bodies. Since they don't break down, it means that once you have them, they're with you forever, and they just build up more and more over time. And then, like I said, these chemicals are today still widely unregulated, which has led to them being found all over, including in 99% of Americans have PFAS in their blood at some level, and studies have even found PFAS in newborns. So this is obviously really concerning and a huge problem. And I want to talk just a little bit about how this has played out in my home state of North Carolina in a really heartbreaking way. So in 2017, an investigative journalist broke a story that found that large chemical manufacturer DuPont, now known as Chemours, had been dumping a type of PFAS chemical into the Cape Fear River. This chemical, Gen X, was something that residents in the surrounding area had not been informed of, didn't know that it was toxic or that it was being dumped into their waterways. And with this plant having existed back since 1980s, it meant that residents of the Cape Fear region had been unknowingly drinking, swimming, and recreating in and fishing from highly contaminated waters for more than 40 years. And today, when you talk to residents in that region, you hear countless stories of mysterious, rare cancers occurring with no family history or background, babies that have been born prematurely, and more. And all of these residents are really left to wonder, is it because of the PFAS chemicals and contaminants that they have consumed? And not only that, but these manufacturers continue to be able to legally dump these same chemicals into our waterways today, and have not only footed residents with the burden of the pollution, but also the cost of trying to clean it up. And unfortunately, this story that we hear in North Carolina is a story that you'll hear in many communities all across the country. And it's clear that, people deserve clean and safe water, as well as safe products. And it's time that we move towards a cleaner and healthier future by taking action to turn off the tap on PFAS. So with that, I will pass it back to John to talk a little bit more about what are some of the solutions that are out there and what we can do.
Thanks, Katie. In some ways, this problem of PFAS is unique, profoundly widespread, and really something new. There are literally thousands of these types of perfluorinated compounds out there. So just to be clear, we're not just talking about one or two chemicals, but rather thousands of chemical compounds. They persist in the environment. That's why they earned the nickname forever chemicals. But I also just want to say, I've been doing this work for a little while. I started as a student activist with MassPIRG at Tufts University back in the 1980s. And, we've seen this movie before where toxic chemicals are put out onto the market without being proven safe. And then decades later, we're dealing with hazardous waste sites, cancer clusters, and all the rest. And this is why we really need to move our entire society towards prevention, a proactive way of protecting health up front instead of cleaning up the mess afterwards. But here we are in this latest iteration of this chemical Russian roulette hazard, and this time PFAS is the problem. The good news is we do have some solutions. So let's go to the next slide. I should just say, this is our vision. I always want to start with what we're fighting for, right? It's about clean water and about our kids' health. We want to protect our rivers like the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, but also the Charles River right here in Massachusetts, just maybe a half a mile from my house, and rivers and streams and lakes all across the country upon which our entire ecosystem depends, and for which most Americans draw their drinking water. And of course, drinking water is a major exposure pathway for these chemicals that can make us sick. Let's go to the next slide. There are two things that we need to do. Again, if we look back at this history of all of these toxic battles that we've fought before, over all kinds of other toxic chemicals, hexavalent chromium, toxic cleansing agents, and so forth and so on, we need to do two basic things. One is we need to clean up the mess that's already out there for sure. But the other more profound thing we need to do is turn off the toxic tap in the first place. We need to stop using these chemicals. So let's talk through these two kinds of policies that we need to look at, and then take a look at where the progress is happening at the state and federal level. In cleaning up the mess, one thing we need to do is set limits on these PFAS chemicals in our drinking water. That will drive the actual techniques used for cleanup and ensure that these chemicals are actually taken out of our drinking water sources in ways that protect public health. Second is we need to hold producers and manufacturers and users accountable for the pollution that they have caused. It shouldn't just be on ratepayers and taxpayers to be cleaning up this mess, but rather the companies that made this mess really are going to have to share in the burden fairly and proportionately if we're ever going to clean up our drinking water and our environment. And then a third thing, which I won't say too much about today, but just to flag, we need to stop risky disposal methods. If we take this stuff out of our drinking water, but then we apply it on cropland where we grow our food, if we take it out of our water, but then burn it and it winds up in the air, we haven't necessarily advanced public health. So we need to be really careful. We've got a really complicated mess on our hands, thanks to the chemical companies and manufacturers that have been using these chemicals. We don't want to make the problem worse. We need to clean it up and prevent further contamination and exposure and threats to public health. But ultimately, the only way to really solve this problem is not just to clean up the mess that's already been caused, but to turn off the toxic tap. A colleague of mine, made the analogy, if you've got a bathtub in your bathroom and it's already overflowing with water, the first thing you need to do is turn off the tap so the problem doesn't get worse, right? And that's what we need to do here. There's already widespread PFAS contamination at hundreds and hundreds of sites across the country. And while we want to clean those up, we also have to just stop adding more toxic PFAS into our environment and drinking water sources. As Katie was indicating, though, the challenge is these chemicals are used in so many different parts of our economy. Convenience has trumped, common sense and public health. So nonstick pans and non-stained fabrics and all that sort of thing. Did we really need these chemicals? I mean, we survived without them for most of humanity and civilization. We really can do without them now. So whether it's cosmetics and food packaging, firefighting foam, apparel, cookware, carpeting, other consumer products, even fracking fluid, if you can believe that. I mean, certainly oil and gas is not oil and gas exploration is not something that we are really huge fans of to begin with, but let's not make the matter worse by adding these persistent chemicals to the equation. And then separate from stopping the use of these chemicals, where they are still being used, we certainly have to ensure that companies are not dumping them into our waterways. Like Katie was saying, Gen X was literally being dumped into the Cape Fear River. That's just insane that we would ever allow a company to dump these toxic chemicals into our waterways, many of which are sources of drinking water. Let's go to the next slide. The good news is that thanks to legislators like you, thanks to grassroots activists who have been pushing back against this pollution, we are starting to see some progress. And before I go to the critical role that state legislators are playing, I just want to give a quick overview of some of the national policy things that are happening, because they help provide context for the important work that you and your colleagues will continue to do on this issue. First thing to note is that one major source of PFAS contamination has been at military bases where they've been using PFAS in firefighting foam. We convinced Congress in a bipartisan move in 2020 to order the Pentagon to phase out the use of PFAS in firefighting foam. That military phase out is now underway. Just a couple of weeks ago, the military issued specifications for non-PFAS containing foam for future purchases. That should hopefully pave the way not only to prevent contamination at military bases, but also for civilian airports to follow suit, although we will need further action by the FAA to ensure that happens across the country. Secondly, in the corporate realm, we're starting to see companies are seeing the writing on the wall, both in terms of liability and market share and their brand image and so forth. The most recent one, 3M, a major producer and manufacturer of these chemicals, announced they will be stopping the use in production. Burger King announced in terms of food wrapping. Some sportswear companies have said they're not going to use PFAS any longer. Again, these are important because when you see that these major companies are saying we can do without these toxic chemicals, that is a good argument to your colleagues in the legislative context that this is doable. We can phase out these chemicals because look at all these companies that are finding safer alternatives and finding that they can do without these chemicals. Finally, EPA is also starting to take some action at the national level. Just about a month or two ago, EPA issued guidance to state permit writers under the Clean Water Act saying you really can and should be using current federal regulations and laws under the Clean Water Act to limit, if not wholly eliminate, the discharge of PFAS pollutants from direct discharges. They're currently doing a pollution control standard review as well, which will reinforce those standards at the national level. And just last week, EPA announced a new proposed initiative to close the door on about 300 old PFAS that are not currently in commerce, but could be reintroduced if EPA doesn't shut the door through the regulatory process and say, yeah, we're done with these. These cannot come back into our products and our waterways. And of course, there are important cleanup steps that EPA is taking too. Many of you may have heard that EPA issued health advisories last year at exceedingly low limits, following the science on how toxic these chemicals are, even at tiny amounts. And now we expect EPA this year to follow suit with enforceable drinking water standards. And then, of course, we also know that in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there was $10 billion for PFAS cleanup. Let's go to the next slide. But really, where the rubber hits the road so often, as many of you know, is in state legislation. State after state after state, we've seen legislators moving forward with proactive steps to reduce or eliminate the use of these toxic substances. Here are some highlights from 2022. In Colorado, Representatives Cutter and Bradfield and Senators Gonzalez and Lee led the effort to ban the use of PFAS in a wide range of consumer products, including carpets, cosmetics, and indeed fracking fluid. In Maryland, Delegate Sarah Love led the charge in Annapolis to remove PFAS from firefighting gear and foam, especially after the high-profile case of a Maryland firefighter who actually lost his life to cancer due to exposure from firefighting gear, their family believes. And in California, we saw a bill to phase out the use of PFAS in cosmetics. It's hard to imagine that we would even allow anything touching our bodies with these toxic chemicals so directly, but great job in California. Some other actions that are on their way: there are many states that have adopted their own limits on PFAS in drinking water, attorneys general and communities that are suing PFAS manufacturers to hold them accountable. And again, I think that's part of the reason that some of these companies are starting to say, hey, we really don't want to be a part of this toxic mess anymore. So kudos to the attorneys general and others that are holding these polluters accountable. Let's go to the next slide. So really, finally, let me just close to say that there's a lot of progress we're making here, even though the threat of PFAS is incredibly widespread and severe. There are solutions out there. We can move to safer alternatives. We're seeing progress at the national level, but state legislatures continue to lead the charge, and they will be critical in our effort to turn off the toxic tap so we can have safe drinking water for all Americans and safe rivers as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, John. And we've got a few minutes that we can take questions from folks. So if anyone has questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function to send those along. And I saw we had one question already about whether or not folks will receive the slide deck, and we will be sending that out after the webinar wraps up.
I see that our colleague Deirdre Cummings put also in the chat that, I didn't have a chance to preview bills that have been very recently introduced for this year, but that Senator Sear and Representative Hogan in Massachusetts have filed a strong PFAS bill that would turn off the tap and ban PFAS in a wide range of products. So excellent to see Massachusetts leading the many other states that have taken similar actions. Hopefully that bill gets traction on Beacon Hill. That's just what we want to see, as more and more states taking preventative measures.
And we have another question coming in that is asking if we can repost the graphic of the different sources, which I can reshare in a second. And while I'm doing that, there's a follow-up question to that asking what is the largest source? So I might turn it to you, John, for that question.
Yeah, largest source is a tricky question because are we talking about, PFAS in the air, in the soil, in the water? There's so many different pathways, so it's hard to know for sure. But certainly in terms of water, the two largest sources where we've seen contamination are one, actual manufacturing locations where PFAS is made or used, like the GenX facility that Katie was talking about, and two are locations where firefighting foam is sprayed often not just in actual fires, but even in training operations where volumes of this foam just gets on the ground and then runs off into nearby waterways. So from a clean water perspective, I'd say discharges from manufacturing facilities and firefighting foam are among the two largest pathways into our water.
Great. And it looks like we had someone else who had basically that same question. So I think that answers that question. But if it doesn't, feel free to let us know. And the next question we had was, what are the chances of major legislation on the federal level?
Well, we did see some strong bipartisan support for the PFAS Action Act last year in Congress. And so I don't know really, given the new makeup of Congress, what we'll see this year. But we do know that across the country, when you poll the public and talk to people, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, there's strong transpartisan support to stop these chemicals from protecting, from getting into our waterways and affecting our kids' health. So that much we have going for us. Great.
We've got a couple more questions rolling in, so we can probably do 2 or 3 more questions before we wrap up. The next question is, are you seeing any new research on the potential risks to produce grown in contaminated soil?
I don't know that I've seen new research, but I have heard increasing concerns from farmers about, they work so hard to grow our food, and then unbeknownst to them, the very soil that they're working with is being contaminated with these chemicals. So I'm hearing that from farmers as a serious concern, but I haven't seen any new studies.
Great. Next question on the list, we've got, there has been discovery of bioaccumulated microplastics in humans and even newborns. Are PFAS and bioaccumulated microplastics the same or two separate but similarly concerning contaminants?
I would say that they are separate. They are separate and serious concerns. There are instances where microplastics can be a carrying vessel for a wide range of toxic substances, and they can also pose health and ecological problems in their own right, but they're really not totally the same problem. We could get rid of microplastics and still have a PFAS problem. We could get rid of PFAS and still have a microplastics problem. We need to tackle both of them.
Awesome. And then I think the last question that we have time for here is, are PFAS substitutes, for example, in firefighting foam, proven to be as effective as PFAS containing products? And are there resources available on that?
The answer is yes. And believe me, there is no way that we would have persuaded Congress or the Pentagon to move away from PFAS containing firefighting foam if it weren't for the fact that several of our NATO allies in Europe have already been using PFAS-free firefighting foam in their militaries on their military bases. And so the evidence was already out there with safe and effective alternatives for PFAS-free firefighting foam, which is what led to the Pentagon, us being able to move the Pentagon away from those toxic chemicals.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much, everyone, for being here today. And I'm just going to flip again to the last slide to make sure that folks have our information. If you do have any questions that we didn't get to in our time today, you can definitely be in touch with us. And we appreciate all the work that you all are doing.
Thanks, everybody.